I worked for a company called ThoughtWorks, if anyone knows them. Like a lot of the guys like Jez Humble, Martin Fowler that wrote the books on Agile and DevOps, like I had the privilege of working with them. And my focus has been on corporate. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Like, and there's a lot of waste in corporate. I know, like, who here does not work in corporate or has never worked in corporate? The amount of waste is ridiculous, but it's also an opportunity for like anyone in the process, whether it's developers, PMs, BAs, etc. It's an opportunity to kind of fix some of this stuff. And I want to start off by asking, when you have business ask you for things, like what are they typically asking for, right? Number one, they want to go faster, right? Like, can you code faster? Can you give me more features? Can you get this out the door as fast as possible? But by the way, I'm not going to give you extra money. You need to do it cheaper, right? Has anyone heard that before? You need to do it cheaper, and you have to do it with less risk. I mean, like, how is this possible? This less is more mentality, et cetera. So there's a solution kind of that I mean, it's been written about for the last 10, 20 years in the software industry, and then in the manufacturing about 30, 40 years. And for anyone that has read Lean Manufacturing, who can guess what the best-selling car is of all time? And I'll give you guys a hint, it's not the VW Bug, contrary. Oh, way off, pardon me? Corolla, you nailed it. Best-selling car of all time, I think 42 million cars sold all time. I think twice as much as the VW Bug. And Toyota actually didn't, it used to be known as like this rinky dink, like, oh, you bought a Toyota, like, why would you buy that? And like everyone knows, like nowadays Toyota is like, it's the staple of quality and like good manufacturing. You buy a Corolla, it'll last. I think even this, today at breakfast, somebody was telling me that they have a 17-year-old Corolla. They've completely changed around their industry. And if you've read the books about lean manufacturing, like they've adopted this process of lean manufacturing, lean leadership, the Toyota way. It talks about a lot of things, but one of the key tenets of lean manufacturing is actually like this waste removal, which I think in Japanese they called it muda. So it's, how do I systematically identify waste and get rid of it? And this is what they applied to manufacturing. And at Nike, I think like a whole bunch of industries started adopting this, like this approach. They actually listed out 7 applied to manufacturing, but when Nike adopted this, I think they listed out like 50% defect rate reduction, huge gains. And my argument is that like in software, it's even bigger. There's no other industry other than software where like the amount of waste is X factor, right? Like if you look at like any other industry, like the difference between a good forklift driver and a bad forklift driver, like a good forklift driver isn't going to magically drive 10 times as fast and stack his pallets twice as fast, etc. In software, especially if you adopt like the right culture, the right practices, eliminate the waste, it's X factor. And that's what I've seen in the industry is like if you really aggressively take a look at your processes, where your waste is happening, like the opportunities aren't like 2% here, 3% here, 4% here. You could eliminate, you could go 10 times as fast. It's possible, I've seen it. And it's often not so much technical. So there's actually 7. These are slightly adopted. If you've seen lean manufacturing, they're a little bit different. The 7 practices of manufacture, the 7 ways of lean manufacturing look a little bit different. I think the top one is inventory. Obviously in software, there's no inventory, so they changed it. These are the 7 lean ways of software development. We're going to kind of focus on 3, but I'm going to glance over the other ones as well. So waste number 1, For manufacturing, it's called inventory. So just have stuff laying around, right? It's not actually like ready. It's wasteful. So I mean, just asking the audience, like, what is your lead time? So when you have a feature and it's ready to go, and you have this new feature, and like the developer tells you, as soon as we get it in production, you're going to start making we're going to start making an extra $1,000 a day. How long does it take you to get it into production? I don't know, like just asking the audience, what 2 months, 1 month? What are some averages here? If it's 4 months, yeah, that's too high. I mean, it's wasteful, right? You're not making $1,000, or I mean, like theoretically $1,000, and you're not proving it out. The best companies in the world, I mean, even companies that I've worked at before, we were able to get that down where like maybe there's a bug or something you really need to get out the door. We've gotten it down to like within an hour. Maybe if it's a little bit, something a little bit bigger, maybe like the full sprint. But if you're getting into months, you should really start analyzing of like really looking into like where your waste is. And I still see like, unfortunately, like in 2019, I still see projects where it takes years to get into production. And if it takes years to get into production, I'm sorry, like you really need to take a step back and figure out like, okay, where is this waste going on? What can I do to fix this? Probably the biggest one that I wanted to talk about is extra features. And this is both like business facing features and also like this technical features of like, oh, web scale, we need web scale, or we need containers, like also this internal developer centric features. And very common scenario that I see with legacy software. So you might have a legacy piece of software, this kind of archaic bike, and somebody decides, you know, it's getting a little bit rickety, and somebody decides we need to replace it, right? We need to rewrite. So they start designing. We're like, okay, we need some Kubernetes, we need some web scale, we need some NoSQL, we need dynamic typing. What else do we need? CQRS, absolutely, CQRS. We need all these features that customers might want, just in case they want them. And then what you usually end up seeing, like from my experience, any type of this big bang initiative ends up with something like the homework car from The Simpsons. And it usually, often, very frequently, it fails. But if you take a step back and look at what you really needed was just a little tricycle instead of like your little archaic thing. And this is one of like the key things I want to talk about is you really need to treat everything, like every line of code, every dependency, everything as a liability. It's just one more thing that could fail. And if it's not needed, don't do it. And a lot of this stuff that I'm going to talk about is, it's gonna sound self-evident. It happens all the time in the industry. So any less code, less pieces, less dependencies, anything that you could do to reduce complexity, do it. It's less liability, it's less things that could break. I mean, the bike, like this bike, there's not a lot of things that could break in it, right? Compared to, compared to something like this. Like is anyone here into cycling? Cycling, yeah. I recently downgraded to Fixie, so it's like a bike with no gears. Sorry, no gears, fixed gears. Much less moving parts. It doesn't break down. It's just less liability. MVP, is everyone here is anyone here not familiar with minimal viable product? It's okay if you're not, but it's one of these ways to get towards like to minimize liability, less code, is always driving towards your MVP. If you don't know what to do next, I mean, like focus on like the business value. Like what can we do to get something out the door that delivers business value instead of the speculative stuff, right? Keep it simple, silly. Anything that whenever you're in a fork in a road, and you have everything else being different. Like if you're not sure if there's like, if you want to take the complicated path or the simple path, and there's no other information that like you're not sure, like always default to the simple path. I mean, sure, maybe you want to do more investigation, absolutely. But if it's a complete like toss up, millions of dollars would have been saved in the industry in Toronto if people just defaulted to simplicity. It doesn't mean that the complicated path isn't sometimes mandated, but I mean, like do your research. And I mean, one of them is like premature optimization. Developers love it, and it's optimizing for performance ahead of time with no metrics, right? Developers always talk. I mean, I'm a developer. We're always, I know we're always trying to like fine tune everything down to web scale. Like, how can I squeeze out extra performance? If you don't have metrics and it's not needed, like developer time is much more expensive nowadays than CPU time. I don't know, like people talk about like the amount of times that I've seen developers talk about like squeezing out, I don't know, a little bit more throughput that saves, I don't know, $10 a month of I don't know, cloud infrastructure, but it took them an extra 3 months to develop. It happens all the time. And it's also actually the other one that I want to point out too is modularization, which has become very prevalent in the last couple of years, where especially with like the push of like for microservices, for whatever reason, there's this default that like whenever I have a small little CRUD app, it has to be like super modularized with multiple repositories and multiple microservices, which adds complexity. Microservices is great, but there's nothing dirty and wrong with like a well-designed monolith. Do it yourself. I still see this very prevalent in the industry. I've seen do-it-yourself everything, like do-it-yourself ORMs, do-it-yourself platforms, do-it-yourself unit testing solutions. Do-it-yourself replacements for Spring Boot is something that I've heard about recently. There's such a plethora of like open source tools or even like cheap tools that are well supported that, I mean, like, I know like Google writes Angular and Facebook writes React and all this stuff is free. Yet for some reason, like teams love, and I know it's like it's the developers in us, like where we love to do things ourselves, but it's such a huge waste. Like really be wary. Just do less, do it yourself. Resume-driven design, super prevalent. Does anyone know this bridge? It was like the bridge that collapsed in Italy 2 years ago. So the story behind this bridge is the engineer or the architect. There's a well-known way of building bridges, and you maximize you have multiple stays, so the cables from the top, and you spread them out. But the engineer or the architect decided, you know what, it would look cooler if we only have one main stay or like on each side. So he really wanted to make it look cool, even though engineering practices told him exactly how to do it. And it fell. It's the same in the industry, and like just like any other developer, I love my shiny objects. I like making things cool, but just be wary when you're making decisions or when your developers are making decisions based on things being cool or fun instead of what the best practice is. A little bit about extra processing. Actually, let's take a 5-minute break, grab some pizza. Feel free to ask me questions. And then we'll start in 5 minutes. is partial resources. So there's been companies, corporate companies where I go to, and you ask like, hey, who's working on who's working on what team? And then they show you this spreadsheet of developer Y works on project A on Monday, project B Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and then half of project D on Friday. It's a huge waste. Like, I think the number is something like 25%. It takes an average of 25 minutes to resume a task. And then like, you're never really specializing on one project. If you have partial resources, ask yourself why. Waiting and delays. Ask yourself in your process from like code to get to production, like how much time are you spending waiting, right? Like how many tickets do you have to do? How many manual tickets of like, hey, I'm gonna send a ticket to the release engineering team to push something to prod, and they're gonna get around to it in like 24 or 48 hours, or I'm gonna send a ticket to QA to test this. How many tickets do you have? If you have more than 0, ask yourself why, and try to reduce it to 0. And then also team silos. This is a really common anti-pattern I see in corporate, where you have one team that writes the code, then you have another team that takes over. Like once the code is done, it's another team that does the bug fixing. Then you have another team that does QA, then another team that does the deploy, and another team that supports it in prod. Like anything that you could do, and I'll go over examples of actually what to do to fix this. But if you have all these like different teams, see what you could do to minimize it. And it's, I mean, one of the main solution is like moving towards self-sufficiency. Can you make teams? And this is what all the big, I know Silicon Valley companies startups are doing, is like this move towards self-sufficiency. Can I have a team that does everything? Like everything that the product needs, can it do it for me? I mean, the question will come up of like, okay, well, I still need external resources. Like I still need machines. How do I get them? That's why you need cloud. I know that like the term cloud has been like overused a lot. It moved to the cloud and cloud native, but at the end of the day, all the cloud means is like it's about having an API to your infrastructure, preferably like self-serve, where I as a developer, if I need a database, if I need an application instance, I should just be able to log in and get it. Okay, maybe it'll cost my team and maybe there's some chargeback, etc. But I need to move to that kind of solution. And this developer platform, like really that's what you want is I as a team, I build features, I build functionality. Like I need a platform. Platform gets thrown around a lot. I know at Scotiabank, it's kind of the Play-Doh accelerator platform. Kubernetes, I'm sure you guys have heard of that. Pivotal does PCF, great product. Amazon Beanstalk or AWS, Google, etc. It's do your teams have a platform that makes their developer teams fully self-sufficient? And it's not just I could get like a VM. It's more than that. It's how quickly can I get logging up and running? How quickly can I get something like a database up and running? I was at a client a couple of weeks ago. They were working on a new app, and like the application was ready in a couple of weeks. It was some Visa application, but they needed, for testing purposes, they need an Oracle database. And the quote that they got from the DBAs was like, okay, it'll take us 3 months to get you a dev instance of Oracle. Make things as self-sufficient, actually, make things as self-serve as possible, right? And then also self-healing. So this means a couple of things. This is also like the high availability where it's guaranteed that things will fail. Physical hardware will fail. The JVM will crash. I'm sure you guys all here write perfect code, right? Like for the developers. Like even if you write perfect code, you're still dependent on third-party libraries. Who knows? Maybe there might be a memory leak. Things might crash. One of the most common wastes that I see is 2 o'clock in the morning, because it's always 2 o'clock in the morning, like Morgan's Law. It's always at the worst time. something crashes, things get escalated, 10 or 20 people get on the phone, on a conference call, like, oh, what's going on? What happened? The server's not running. And then eventually IT logs in and just realizes that they have to restart the machine because, I don't know, the system ran out of memory. Something that quite frankly was unavoidable, but why not have a mechanism in place that like self-heals? Like if something is detected as not working, you need a platform that does this for you. And this is the amount of late night calls that I've been in that would have been completely avoided by like some kind of mechanism like this is pretty high. And then also the patching too, right? Like if you give developers access to VMs, like you're responsible for this VM, who's actually patching it? Are they patching it? Are they wasting their time patching it? Like some of the most common security breaches nowadays are out-of-date software. I think Equifax, are you guys familiar with the Equifax data breach? Out-of-date software. So who's actually patching it? Are the developers working on patching the JVM or patching the OS? Or is this somehow automatic or in a better way? And then ultimately at the end of the day, the more time you're not spending managing VMs and all this other stuff. I mean, that's just, I want to point out that that's time you're just spending adding business value. This one's a pet peeve of mine. Does anyone read Jez Humble, Continuous Delivery by Jez Humble? Great DevOps book. I would say it's like kind of the staple DevOps book. Branching is antithetical to continuous integration. I would say if your branches in software as a developer, because I know there's some non-technical people, if they last more than a day, take a hard look of like why, and definitely move towards trunk-based development. That's how Facebook does it. Like, I mean, they do things called feature toggling, etc. A lot of corporate is still stuck on these long-lived feature branching where you're not integrating, you're not catching bugs, you're not, if person makes a change over here to some code, another change to over here, like you can't tell right away if there's some kind of incompatibility. Oh, and this one, some people may disagree with me on this, but another huge waste that I see is these manual, these 100% mandated code reviews, gated code reviews where specifically when it takes a couple of days to get a pull request, where you have like these great teams, I think even Szoltysek Scotiabank, like great teams, all senior developers, but for whatever reason, corporate is mandated that everything has to go through a formal code review through, I don't know, through GitLab or something. And then the average time is about 2 weeks. 2 weeks to get approved. Like even if I just tweak my little CSS to like, oh, move this button to the right, 2 weeks. Stuff like that. I mean, I advocate to like simple stuff, just check it in. I'll trust my team. You should have, I mean, if you're concerned about the little changes, just add static code analysis, let it break the build. But for the bigger changes, like if it's taking you days on average to get pull requests approved, take a look at that and maybe encourage like, hey, if it's a small change, like if you're just editing a CSS file, just commit it. Handoffs, huge waste. I mean, kind of what we talked about before. How many handoffs of your like artifacts do you have in your process? I mean, take a look at it. How many handoffs, how many teams are touching this thing, playing hot potato? Ideally, it should be one. I'm not saying get to one right away, but one should be the direction you should be moving to. And if it's more than one, take a look at why. A couple of solutions. Have more embedded team members. So I mean, QA, I'm a huge fan of having like embedded QA team members. Like QA sits with the developers, actively working with them, not offshore or somewhere else. Even security, everything should be embedded. Your DevOps guy, yeah, absolutely. If you guys do a lot of DevOps, then maybe have one developer that's really strong in DevOps and does the Jenkins stuff, instead of you having to create tickets and putting them in in the ether and like waiting a couple of days. Like, who knows when this will be done? I've done a lot with offshore. I know it looks really great. Like, who here does offshore developments? A little bit. Which region? India. It looks great from a financial point of view. I think the fully loaded costs come out to about 1/3. When you start factoring things in, it gets very close to like almost no cost saving. You have to fly people over. You have to, you have this 12-hour time difference. Like, the amount of times I've talked to QAs or developers in India, and the teams here are sleeping, and then the teams in India don't know what to do. So you come into work in the morning and like, oh, I didn't know what to do. So I sat around and did nothing for 12 hours because you didn't have that co-location and that communication. I have seen more success in like time zones that are closer. So especially like Brazil or like even Eastern Europe, I've had more success with that, especially if you could line up the hours. I would be very wary of offshore. The only way I've seen it work is if you completely set up the project, like split up the projects. Like India, you're responsible for this product. Canada, you're responsible for this product. That's maybe when I would see it work. But in general, if corporate tells you, like, randomly throws Indian developers at you and then expects you to be like just as efficient as a developer here, I would argue that that's not true. More co-location. I'm a huge fan of co-location, just like Pivotal. I mean, we have, if you guys see around here, all of our teams or clients sit together, pair program. You kind of break. It's a lot easier to talk to people face to face than via emails. Jeff Bezos, actually, this came out of, has anyone heard of the two medium pizza team size? This came out of Amazon, where they kind of found that like the ideal team structure should be enough people that you could feed by 2 medium pizzas. I think it's 7 or 8 or 9, 7, 8, 9. Fully self-sufficient. If you need a QA, you have a QA. If you need a DBA, you have a DBA. But this 2 medium-sized team with everything that you need on it, and anything that you need external, just API-based. Defects, this is a quick one. Has anyone here lost their keys before? Yeah. How much easier is it to find your keys if you lost them in the last 5 minutes, right? Like, if you lost your keys in the last 5 minutes, like, okay, well, where have I been in the last 5 minutes? Just go there. It's pretty easy. If you lost your keys in the last month, it becomes a lot harder. Like, even though it's the same thing, it's exactly the same thing with bugs. Fix your bugs as soon as possible. It's the waste of waiting. Just like, even if it's the same bug, if you wait to fix your bug, it's going to cost you a lot longer. Maybe the developer is going to leave. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you're going to like completely forget what code was written in that time. If you could find and fix things right away, you'll save time. So that's it for the 7 wastes. And I would encourage you guys to like take a step back and like identify where your wastes are. And I'll kind of walk through kind of my kind of top observations in the industry. And some of the wastes are just smells. Like, even if you see them, it doesn't, maybe in the context, it may work. Maybe that's what's needed, but definitely like treat it as smell of like, if you do see some of these things of like playing hot potato between 7 different teams, like maybe you need to look at it. Pivotal, we do something called value stream analysis. There's some great books written about it where you take a deep dive into like the process of, okay, what does it take to get into production? And like, let's map it out. Like, what are all the different gates? What are all the different steps? Map it out. And then you start identifying it. That's one thing that I look into. In terms of my kind of observed, like my observations from the last 20 years of like observed top software waste smells in corporate. These are smells. So like, I'm sure that there's some context of where they might be needed. Excessive modularization, very prevalent right now with the microservice hype. I find startups have kind of realized, okay, maybe we don't need to turn everything into microservices. Corporate typically lags a little bit. They're still lagging a little bit. I've been on a lot of engagements where there's more source code repositories than there's team members. And then every time somebody new joins, they have to check out 12 repositories, connect them all up together by ports, and then just to get the software running. Monoliths, the word monolith should not be a dirty word. Long-lived branches, we talked a little bit about that. Too many team handoffs to get into production. I love always asking people like, okay, how many teams touch your artifact to get into production? Ideally, it should be one. It's doable. I've seen it in corporate and I've seen it in banks. I could tell you, I could comment, I'm not gonna say which ones, but some banks, we've been able to convince people to like, it requires buy-in from corporate, but to have these self-sufficient teams where even the developers, like the tech lead, can push into production. Absolutely, there's like mechanism in place to track who did it for auditing, et cetera, and to roll back easily. But you can do that in corporate, and I've seen that in corporate where developers can push into production instead of actually my other pet peeve is the term segregation of duties. It's just this word that gets, I don't know if anyone, does anyone know that term? But the banks throw it around all the time. It's, no one's been able to fully like show me on paper that it's mandated. It's just segregation of duties. Why? Why do you have so many teams? Segregation of duties. Long lead, the other big smell is like long lead times to get into production. I would say if it takes you 6 months to get into production or even a month, I would take a step back and really identify, like do something like a value stream analysis, take a step back and look at why, like why is it taking you a month? It's a huge amount of waste. Partially allocated resources. If you have developers that are working on multiple teams at the same time, ask why. Yeah, this one's big. I see that a lot now where Kubernetes is a great solution. It's, I know a recent tweet that I saw was Kubernetes is great for building platforms. There's a lot of stuff that it does for you. It's a container orchestration system. It's much better than what, how things used to be in the past with like just pure VM management. Absolutely, it's better. But it's gotten so much hype behind it where teams are moving from this higher level abstraction that's easier and takes care of things for you, like PCF or Heroku or Amazon Beanstalk, and they're moving down where it's more work because Kubernetes is the hype of the day. And not to say that it's bad. Optimizing without metrics. If you're optimizing performance without metrics, that's a smell to me. I used to do video game programming, and like you would, if you're like, you would optimize performance. So you would tune a little bit, see if it's faster. If it's faster, you'd leave it in there. And if it's not, you would take it out, and you keep doing that. But just optimizing for the sake of optimizing. Anytime I hear like these synergy words of web scale and non-blocking and no numbers, my spidey senses tingle. I see this in corporate too. This project staffing is another smell that I would look into if you guys are doing it, where corporate gets a budget. So you have a budget to put together an app. Okay, here's 3 months budget for developers, and they work on the app, and it's done, and then all the developers leave, and then nobody works on it, and then a couple of months later, it's like, oh, well, we have bugs. Like, who knew? So you put other developers on it. What you want to move to is a way of like this longer term product-based staffing where you just stay on this team that's responsible for the product. There's always going to be bug fixing. There's always going to be new functionality, but that knowledge lost of like moving developers around isn't going to be there. I see this a lot right now. It seems like this defaulting to SPAs, so single page apps for technical people. So if you ever hear React or Angular, great tools. It's overkill for simple apps. And the amount of complexity that it adds, if you just want a little CRUD application, overkill. you don't need it. Like Angular and React.js, which are like the two most popular ones, aren't what really make the app look pretty. I mean, you could just use Twitter Bootstrap or something like that. That's all you need. You could still use standard Java templates, etc. And you could do, your developers would be able to code things out much quicker. But for the more complicated apps, absolutely. Nothing wrong with React.js or Angular. I would say Angular is better. Reinventing the wheel. Yeah, pretty prevalent. Kind of, we talked about this. Like, instead of working on adding business value, you're reinventing the wheel. You're creating custom testing frameworks. You're creating your own Spring Boot. You're creating your own platform, which I'm not going to name banks. Focus on business value. There's such a great amount of like free open source tools out there. Yes, maybe they're not going to be 99, like they're going to be 1% slower than your fine-tuned code, but like, don't reinvent the wheel. And last one, treating new technologies as silver bullets. So coming in and saying like, hey, if we just use technology X, everything would be much better. Like everything would be better. And then the ones that I've heard, Scala, now it's Kubernetes. Like if we just use Kubernetes, everything would be awesome. Microservices. I think 5 years ago was NoSQL. I know somebody mentioned Secure. I've been hearing that one. What else? What else have you guys heard? Serverless. I could rant about serverless. Yeah. So whenever somebody promises, whenever somebody's too fixated on like especially shiny new technology, I would be wary. There is no silver bullet in software. I mean, it takes a lot more than just like the right tech. I mean, it's the right culture, it's the right practices, etc. Yeah, so that's it. So feel free to ask me questions, especially if you're interested in like how. Feel free to like ask me like after or now, or like rant about all your waste. I mean, like what big wastes do you guys see? I know that I saw some nodding on some of the key issues. Yeah, it's not an easy fix. Yeah. 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 So sometimes it's difficult to celebrate, so trying to do small increments, little bits. Once they're about business knowing it, about anything major risk. I agree with you 100%. And it's not, unfortunately, that one's not easy to fix because you really need to convince business. I find if you tell people these things enough times, eventually they give in. But yeah, so definitely I encourage telling your superiors about products instead of project staffing. What other big ones do you guys hear? I know I hear serverless. Somebody mentioned serverless. That's a big one nowadays. Not that it's bad. It definitely has its purposes, but it's not a magic bullet. Yeah. Any other big ones? I think companies practices, you need to have, especially the handoffs and the increase of production, a lot of things about making sure things are in place like Defects. I think as much automated as possible, because having a smaller team also means that you spend more. You can't spend all your time setting up and looking after service, patching it, setting up data. Oh, absolutely, yeah. So that's what a lot of times spending automated as much as possible. Look at that RDM API self-serve. But it takes time to get there. It's not something you, unfortunately, you're not going to buy a package of, or not sure somebody's going to fit your team exactly, what's going to be best all of a sudden, the culture set up. You need to put into what your process, what your business model, release cycle, what your culture, it's the way you work. So you need to work organically, but rather than you have to work on it. Absolutely. So it comes back to doing something like Agile, that feedback loops that after this sprint is just looking at, what went well from a Yeah. I fire him. I'm joking. No, no, it's always like these custom ORMs. As soon as that person leaves, it just falls apart. But let me. Sorry, what was your question? Sorry, because this ORM thing is a huge pet peeve. Another pet peeve of mine because I've seen it numerous times. Like, why don't you just use hibernate or nhibernate? Yeah. I wouldn't fire people. No, but it always eventually, okay, so you have an ORM, an in-house ORM solution, and it's just slowing everyone down. What would I do? And the person is still there. I find those people always leave when they don't have shiny objects. And quite frankly, like if a developer tells me, and I've had developers tell me that like they only ever want to work on cool stuff, I consider them a liability. Like, because they're gonna create a mess for you, like an ORM. Like if you have developers tell you that they never want to roll up their sleeves and actually like fix things and document the ORM properly, like really address the issues. Like, who knows, maybe in that domain it was needed. Maybe there's some high throughput needed, but it sounds like there's issues and there's documentation lacking and lack of education. And if that developer doesn't want to like work on improving things, then if you don't want to, I mean, one solution is just to put them on bug fixing until they quit, because they'll quit pretty quickly. Like, here you do bug fixing, they'll quit within a couple of months. Yeah. Yep. Anything else? Me and Jesse are going to be around. Definitely feel free to come talk to either of us. Thanks for coming, guys.